So Gareth A. Davies and various other mainstream media journalists are now reporting that Anthony Joshua is close to accepting a £15 million step-aside deal to allow the undisputed fight between Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury. £15 million is somewhere around $20 million. Now, this is unconfirmed. It's just a media rumor at this point. They haven't named any sources even. But if we work on the assumption that it is true, and I'm not saying that it is, but just for hypothetical purposes of this video, let's assume that it's true and that Anthony Joshua does accept this step-aside deal. I, as you guys will know by now, if you've been watching my videos for any length of time, think that this is good. Not only is it good for the heavyweight division, because I think we need to see an undisputed champion sooner rather than later, but I also think it's good for Anthony Joshua and his development as a fighter, and even his recovery, his psychological recovery and his technical progression. The only person who this situation isn't good for, as far as I'm concerned, is potentially Dillian Whyte. Although I assume that since they are working out a step-aside deal for Anthony Joshua, they'd have to do the same for Dillian Whyte and compensate him as well. Now, the rumor is, again, per Gareth A. Davies, that the fight between Tyson Fury and Usyk will be taking place in the Middle East, and that surely would be the logical thing, because they, as in the Saudis, or perhaps it'll be in Dubai or somewhere else in the Middle East, but that is the region which you would imagine would be able to come up with the type of money necessary to pay Anthony Joshua a $20 million or £15 million step-aside deal, pay Dillian Whyte, and of course pay both Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. So you're talking about an enormous amount of money, and out there, people throw around enormous amounts of money like it's monopoly dough. So the Dillian Whyte situation, we need some clarification on that. Again, I'm not saying any of this stuff with regards to AJ stepping aside is true. It's just a mainstream media rumor at this point. But if it is true, I think it's a good thing. Anthony Joshua is definitely going to be criticized, ridiculed, etc. by many people if he takes this step-aside deal. And he's going to lose a lot of fans. I think Anthony Joshua has already lost a lot of fans since that first Ruiz fight, from then to now. Because a lot of the people that follow Anthony Joshua are casuals. They're what football fans call glory supporters. They'll wait till somebody is doing really well. And particularly with Anthony Joshua, he's got all these endorsements and sponsorship deals, and he's part of all these different projects. And of course, he's got a large female following, as well as his casual male following, and of course the hardcores that were with him from, well, his amateur days, really. So the bulk of Anthony Joshua's followers, as is the case with all superstar fighters, the bulk of them are casuals, fair weather fans, glory supporters. And those people tend to be very fickle, as the name implies, glory supporters. Once they no longer see you as glorious anymore, because your fortunes have taken a downturn, then they're going to go and seek somebody else to support, and somebody else whose glory they can try and share in. And for a guy like AJ, that might be a difficult thing to take, because he's been so used to being adored by millions of people, being praised and being worshipped by all these fans. So to then have them turn around and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that AJ's taking a step-aside deal. What a coward. How disappointing. You know, they might see it that way. And that will be a very bitter pill, potentially, for Anthony Joshua to swallow. I remember something that Spencer Fearon said. I think it was after the first Ruiz fight, which was that, according to him, Anthony Joshua doesn't have that many boxing people in his team. He's really only got Rob McCracken. According to Spencer Fearon at that time, he really only had Rob McCracken and, one or two others. The majority of his team were made up of friends, I think a couple family members, and, nutritionists, sports science people. He got a lot of sports science people around him. This, to me, was very problematic, because although we call boxing the sweet science, it's really more of an art than a science. If you're someone that views boxing in a scientific way, right, like a game of top trumps, you're looking at a guy's height and reach and his weight and how much he can lift on a bench press, how much he can curl, how fast he can sprint 100 meters, what his lung capacity is. If you're looking at all these things and using that as the basis to predict who's going to win a fight, then you're going to have a really bad betting record. Because in boxing, the intangibles matter, and the intangibles are intangible. How do you quantify a guy's confidence? How do you quantify a guy's heart? You know, the amount of courage he has. How do you quantify a guy's boxing IQ? These are things you can't quantify, or certainly not very easily or in a standardized way. So the intangibles are very, very important in boxing. There are plenty of people that are incredible athletes, but they don't make incredible boxers, you see? So you want people around you who understand the intangibles, not just people who are obsessed with hitting PBs on the treadmill. No. You want a couple of people like that maybe in your team. The majority of them need to be boxing people. Boxing is not a purely athletic endeavor. If it was, that you could take people from track and field and turn them all into world champions and make a lot more money than they make in running track, right? Than they would make running track. But it's not that easy. And a lot of the casuals that are fans of Anthony Joshua got that rude awakening when he got knocked out by Andy Ruiz, because they couldn't understand how a guy who looks like Ruiz, who aesthetically is inferior to Anthony Joshua in every way, who athletically seems to them inferior to Anthony Joshua. This guy can't outbench AJ. This guy can't beat AJ in a 100-meter sprint. This guy can't do more on the Versa climber and more crunches and push-ups and pull-ups and dips. He can't do any of that more than AJ. How is it possible that he was able to beat him up the way that he did? They couldn't understand it. I mean, I remember way back in the days I was with my older brother and one of his friends, and we watched Vladimir Klitschko get knocked out by Corey Sanders. And my brother's friend, who was a casual, was absolutely gobsmacked. He could not believe what he was seeing. And in fact, he suggested that the fight might have been fixed. He was like, do you reckon he took a dive? And I was like, no, he did. Of course he didn't take a dive. Why on earth would he take a dive against a guy who was nearly 40 years of age, who was on the brink of retirement? It makes no logical sense. Klitschko was earning loads of money at that point. Why would he take a dive against a guy who's pushing 40, who's got one foot in retirement? No. I mean, look at the punches that were landed. Of course it wasn't a dive. But again, this guy's perception of fighting was so different from the reality, because he was thinking it was more of a science, when actually it's more of an art. You see, there's a science element to it, but it's really more of an art. So Anthony Joshua needs boxing people around him, needs people who understand the intangibles. And I think he needs to understand the intangibles more, because the fact he had so many of those sports science people around him and nutritionists is indicative of the fact that he, or at least suggestive of him, being far too caught up in the science aspect of things and not immersed enough in the artistry of boxing. You see it? So yeah, I think it's a good thing if AJ does take the step aside deal, because this is a guy who doesn't really have a clear sense of direction in what he's doing at this point. And why do I say this? Well, because of the fact that he has been trialing with so many different trainers in the run-up to this Usyk rematch. That right there shows you that he's not sure what to do. When Lennox Lewis got knocked out by Oliver McCall, he immediately called up Manny Stewart. I think it was less than a month after the fight. Might have even been, a couple of weeks after the fight. He called up Manny Stewart and he said, would you train me? And this is the guy that just trained Oliver McCall to knock Lewis out. His first professional defeat. Okay? So in Lewis's mind, there was absolutely no doubt who he was going to call. He fired Pepe Correa and straight away got on the phone and called Manny Stewart, basically. Now, he was familiar with Manny Stewart because as an amateur, Lennox Lewis, and I think maybe even in his early pro career, I'm not sure, but certainly as an amateur, Lennox Lewis, who lived in Ontario in Canada, used to cross the border quite regularly to go and train at the Kronk for sparring and stuff like that at the Kronk gym. Detroit and where Lennox Lewis lived in Kitchener, Ontario, are not a million miles away, okay? So, and also Lewis was considering, or I think he nearly did, sign a management deal with Manny Stewart very early on in his pro career. I think to turn pro, he was going to sign some kind of deal with Manny Stewart, who would be his manager and perhaps his trainer as well. But that arrangement didn't happen. He ended up going to Frank Maloney and Panas Eliadis, and the rest is history. But Lewis just knew, intuitively, instinctively, that Manny was the guy. A similar situation with Tyson Fury and Manny Stewart's nephew, Javon Sugar Hill, who now goes by the name of Sugar Hill Stewart. And, Tyson Fury was working with Ben Davison for a number of fights, but he realized he needed somebody else to take him to the next level. And that somebody else was Javon Sugar Hill. And again, his cousin Andy Lee was a Kronk fighter under Manny Stewart, but he also knew Javon Sugar Hill very well. And Tyson Fury, of course, had been in the Klitschko camp at one stage. He never sparred Klitschko, but he was invited to the Klitschko camp by Andy Lee. And he, I believe, met Javon Sugar Hill then. But no, I think he might have met Javon Sugar Hill when he took himself to the Kronk gym at one stage. I can't remember whether that was before or after he was in the Klitschko camp. But either way, he had met Javon Sugar Hill. He might have done a little bit of work with him. So fast forward years later, after the Otto Wallen fight, Tyson Fury didn't need to audition 20 different trainers in order to figure out who would be the best fit for him. He knew enough about boxing. He knew enough about himself. He knew enough about what he didn't have, the elements of his game that were underdeveloped. And he knew exactly who would be the perfect person to develop those elements of his game. And that was Javon Sugar Hill. Anthony Joshua doesn't seem to have this certainty about him. He doesn't seem to know what to do, who the right person is. So, on a surface level, it seems logical. AJ trialing with as many different trainers as possible. But you would have thought he would have found someone by now. Being that the Usyk fight, right, which may not be happening at this point, at least not next, given the fact that Usyk fight is apparently, potentially so close, you would have thought he would have found the right trainer at this point. Trialed with a guy and thought, this is him. This is the guy. I could just sense it. But he doesn't seem to have that intuition at this point, that instinct. It all seems to be up in the air with Anthony Joshua. And I do think that, again, some of it may be to do with the kind of people that he's surrounded with. He needs to be back in a spit and sawdust environment, in my view, a professional spit and sawdust environment, not the amateur setup. Because the amateur setup is all very clinical. It's all very sporting. Boxing is fighting. It's the fight game. Professional boxing I'm talking about. All of the sporting stuff and slaps on the back and jolly good show and all that kind of stuff, that's for amateur boxing. In professional boxing, it's fighting. It's a whole different world. It's hardcore. It's gritty. It's dirty. Okay? It's heartless in a certain sense. And I think Anthony Joshua, not that Anthony Joshua needs to be thrown in to the lion's den and battered and, knocked down every sparring session and all that kind of thing, but he needs to be around people of a certain type of mentality, in my view. And hopefully that mentality will spark something in him. And we know that Anthony Joshua has it, or I believe Anthony Joshua has it. He has that meanness in him. He has that eye of the tiger in him. We saw it early on in his career, certainly against Dillian Whyte, where he came back from adversity in that fight. And when he got hurt against Dillian Whyte, you didn't see the look of shock in AJ's eyes that we later saw, for example, when he was dropped by Andy Ruiz. He just looked totally shocked. Against Dillian Whyte, he gets hurt, and then he's smiling and smirking at Dillian Whyte, and he comes back at him. So it's there somewhere inside him, but I say it's there. It used to be there somewhere inside him. Is it still there? Who knows? Is it a case of the success turning Anthony Joshua a little bit soft, as some people might describe it? Again, who knows? But I do think that stepping away or stepping aside, in this case potentially, is the best thing to do, because it will give him the time he clearly needs to figure out where he's going and what he's doing. Because he seems like a confused fighter at this point. And it's also a case of him gelling with a new trainer, working on the things that he needs to work on, not just to try and beat Usyk in a rematch, but to make the most out of his ability in general. Because as far as I'm concerned, Anthony Joshua is not the finished product. There's a lot more that you could do with a fighter of his dimensions, his athleticism, and his track record, because he has achieved a lot in the sport, amateur and pro. I just feel if you train him in the right way, mentally, physically, technically, you can get even more out of him. And mentally, I think that being away from the spotlight would help Anthony Joshua at this stage, because he has been under consistent, massive pressure since the very beginning of his career. He was under a lot of pressure when he turned pro, and the pressure has just built and built and built and built and built. There is no heavyweight in the world that has been under such consistent pressure as Anthony Joshua. And I'm talking about, the perceived pressure, the expectations of the fans, and, the magnitude of the event and all this kind of thing. Tyson Fury, of course, has been in some high pressure fights, some big fights with Wilder, with Vladimir Klitschko, but he hasn't been under the spotlight to the degree that Anthony Joshua has been for as long as AJ has been. And this is something I was concerned about early on in Anthony Joshua's career. If you go back and watch the earliest videos I made about AJ's pro career, I was saying then that I was a little concerned about AJ being, brought along in the spotlight the whole time. I felt like a guy as inexperienced as him, remember, AJ didn't have hundreds of amateur fights. So I felt like a guy as inexperienced as him might benefit from not having the spotlight on him so much. Fighting lower down the card with less fanfare so he can learn his trade first before he then puts himself in the spotlight where he's going to be more heavily scrutinized, where there's going to be a lot more expectation on him. That's traditionally the way it's done. But in this day and age, certainly with Eddie Hearn, he likes to try and make guys stars immediately as soon as they turn pro. And from a business perspective, you can understand the thinking, but sometimes that can backfire. Now, with all that being said, AJ has done tremendously well to hold it together as well as he has under the enormous amount of pressure he's had to endure from his pro debut to now, which has just been building and building and building. Unbelievable expectations. So he's done tremendously well, but pressure can get to anybody eventually, especially a fighter who, like I said earlier, in my view, is not the finished article. It's one thing having all this pressure on you when you're the finished article, when you're as good as you're ever going to get, when your technique is as good as it could possibly be, when you've got all the experience, when you know all the veteran moves. At that stage, yeah, pile all the pressure on. Okay? But AJ isn't there yet. He isn't as good as he could be technically, mentally, tactically. He's not there yet. So you're talking about an incomplete fighter having to deal with unbelievable amounts of pressure, the likes of which Tyson Fury, and the rest of the fighters in the division, even Deontay Wilder, haven't had to deal with so consistently. I mean, to put it in perspective, what is Tyson Fury's biggest purse so far in his career? Just to give you an example of the difference in pressure that AJ's been under compared to Fury. Fury's biggest purse is what, 20 million, 25 million, something like that? Anthony Joshua's biggest purse so far was $60 million against Andy Ruiz in the rematch, as far as I'm aware. Okay? And of course, in boxing, attention, right, how many people are watching equals money in most cases. You monetize the interest, and there's been a lot more interest. If you add up all the viewership figures together for Anthony Joshua throughout his career, there's been a lot more interest in Anthony Joshua's career overall than in Tyson Fury's career. Now, obviously, in recent times, this dynamic is starting to change a bit, with Tyson Fury becoming, gaining in popularity, with Anthony Joshua perhaps losing a bit of popularity. But overall, AJ's been the more popular fighter, had much greater expectations placed upon him and so on. So, he's done tremendously well. But at this point, I think stepping away or stepping aside and just allowing the pressure to be lifted from his shoulders, the expectation to be lifted from his shoulders, I think that'll do him the world of good psychologically, and will create an environment which will be more conducive to him improving technically, mentally, and so on. I think that Anthony Joshua probably needs to be written off. He needs these fair weather fans temporarily, of course, because, long term, you're trying to make as much money as you can, and that therefore you need as many fans as you can. But in terms of fighter development, I think Anthony Joshua would benefit from being written off from these fair weather fans leaving and so on, because it takes a lot of pressure off him. And when he comes back, people will be thinking, he's not going to do much. He stepped aside against Usyk. He's scared. He don't have it. Perhaps that's what he needs. Then again, maybe not, because some fighters, when they're used to getting all the love and they don't get the love, it can leave them traumatized. It can leave them bitter, and it can actually have the opposite effect of what I'm talking about. But in the case of Anthony Joshua, I suspect it will have a positive effect. I mean, some people observed AJ in the ring after the first Andy Ruiz fight, right? His first pro loss. And they said that he looked relieved. And there was some criticism of AJ that he didn't look devastated. He looked like a man who was relieved. And I think I actually said that in one of my post-fight videos, that he had a look of relief on his face. And to me, that was relief from all the pressure. You know, it was like a release. All this pressure the guy's been under. He gets knocked out. You know, to hell with it, it's happened now. Breathe a sigh of relief. You know, because there's all this pressure on you not to lose. And in your mind, you're thinking, oh God, what if I do lose? You know, what are people going to say? How are people going to react? Will people lose faith in me? Will they be disappointed? You know, sometimes, I mean, that's the kind of pressure I'm talking about. And then when he lost, he was like, okay, it's done now. It's done. That pressure to not lose is now off my shoulders, you know? So obviously he's lost at a point. He's already lost at the point he fights Usyk and then he loses again. But then there's the pressure to come back. Then there's the pressure to prove himself. Then there's the pressure to be macho and show that he can do the same thing to Usyk that he did to Andy Ruiz. You see? And I just don't think he needs that pressure right now. Not when he's unsure of what he needs to improve on as a fighter. Which trainer is going to be best for him. Not just from a technical point of view, but somebody that can gel with him in terms of personality and understand his mindset. In this particular situation, I think it's a good thing if AJ steps aside, gives himself time to figure it all out, and then comes back, written off by all these fans. An underdog, an outsider, you know? Now, the way it would work if AJ takes a step-aside deal, the way it normally works or often works in these situations, is that AJ gets a guaranteed shot at the winner. I don't know whether he would take an interim fight. In an ideal scenario, at least from my perspective, AJ would take at least one interim fight. You'd fight somebody else in between. Now, from a business perspective, Eddie Hearn might not want that because he's thinking, well, if AJ gets beat in the interim fight, then he's blown the chance of getting the rematch with Usyk or Fury, right? The winner of the Usyk and Fury fight for the Undisputed. He's blown that. But look, in life and certainly in boxing, and even more certainly in heavyweight boxing, nothing is to be taken for granted. There are no certainties. As me saying certainly in heavyweight boxing. Well, there are no certainties in heavyweight boxing. Sometimes you got to roll the dice. A lot of the time you got to roll the dice. Just as I was speaking about earlier with regards to boxing being more art than science, the same goes with the way you plan your career and the moves that you make in your career. Business move. You can't always be completely scientific about it. Sometimes you got to go with your gut. Sometimes you got to go with your instinct. And that might contradict what on the surface seems most logical. But you just know that, no, the logical thing in this sense, in this particular instance, isn't actually going to work out. Well, you sense it, you feel it, you intuit it. So, yeah, Anthony Joshua, in this case, would take money, step aside, and probably not have an interim fight. But I think at least one interim fight would be better to acclimatize himself with the new trainer. I was watching a G-Man video recently where he was talking about Joseph Parker and how much he's improved under Andy Lee. But with the first Chisora fight, he only had a few weeks with Andy Lee, and you didn't really see much improvement or much change. Whereas going into the second fight, well, as we saw in the second fight, there was a lot more improvement from Joseph Parker. So, same with Anthony Joshua. If he could have at least one fight with a new trainer in the interim before stepping in there against the winner of Usyk against Fury, I think that would benefit him. And, psychologically, technically, gelling with the trainer, having less pressure on his shoulders, and then going into the Undisputed fight as an underdog with all the pressure being on the other guy. Imagine if particularly Tyson Fury beats Usyk in the Undisputed fight. Imagine he wins well. Let's say he even stops Usyk, and then he's going into this fight with Joshua. Let's say Joshua takes an interim fight, maybe goes the distance, trying out his boxing and doing this and that. Doesn't look devastating in the interim fight. Tyson Fury at that point is a huge favorite. He goes in there, everyone thinks he's going to win. Everyone thinks he's going to blast AJ out 5, 6, 7 rounds, like most of his team have been saying for years. The fans all think Fury's going to do it, or the vast majority of them. Even a lot of people that used to be AJ fans, you know, these fair weather fans, a lot of them are on Fury's team and cheering him on now, you know, completely forgetting about the fact that there were people that used to hate Fury, but all of a sudden, now they're on Fury's coattails. So in that situation there, with Anthony Joshua being written off and being the underdog, it might actually work for him. Tyson Fury, I think, is a fighter who, if he has any weaknesses psychologically, overconfidence may be one of them. Something Lennox Lewis himself suffered from. Lewis would get overconfident. That's why he lost to Oliver McCall. That's why he lost to Hasim Ratman. All Lewis's big fights against the marquee names, he won. It was against the guys who weren't marquee names where Lewis came unstuck, you see? Now, if you go back and look at Anthony Joshua's amateur career, he did well as the underdog. You look at him in the World Championships. He beat Camarel in the World Championships in Azerbaijan. I mean, that was a big upset at the time. He then got all the way to the final and lost to the gold medalist, you know, in the final by 1 point. If you're losing in Azerbaijan to an Azerbaijani in the final by only 1 point, that means you did very, very well. That means a case can be made that you actually won. And this was a very inexperienced Anthony Joshua. So he was really a revelation for Britain in super heavyweight in the amateur scene. A revelation. Because for a guy as inexperienced as he wasn't expected to go out there and be beating all these elite level, amateurs with hundreds of fights under their belt. And of course, AJ in the Olympics, most of us believe he lost to Erislandi Savon. The rematch he had with Camarel, because again, he'd beaten Camarel in the World Championships. In the Olympics, he had a rematch with him in the final. And, you know, some people believe Camarel was a little hard done by there. Well, he wasn't hard done by in the World Championships. Okay. So yeah, AJ had some questionable decisions in the amateurs, no doubt. But he also had some real good, legit wins. No doubt about that either. And those real good wins came when Anthony Joshua was an underdog, you know? So maybe he'll actually thrive being an underdog. Maybe he'll surprise some people. Maybe he'll surprise Tyson Fury. I think that Tyson Fury is more likely to underestimate Anthony Joshua than Alexander Usyk. I think Alexander Usyk is a more stable character mentally and emotionally than Tyson Fury. I suspect he's less prone to overconfidence. Tyson Fury is a very gregarious individual, you know, very much a people person and what have you. And he's somebody that can get carried away quite easily, Tyson Fury. Sometimes carried away with himself quite easily. So, yeah, if anyone is going to underestimate AJ in the scenario I've described, I imagine it would be the Gypsy King. And that would certainly be to his detriment. So, I mean, just look at Tyson Fury's career so far. He hasn't lost, but he has had some close shaves, right? John McDermott was a close shave, the first fight. Steve Cunningham, Nevin Pikich, where he's getting dropped by these guys who he probably underestimated. Even Otto Wallin, more recently. A lot of people, probably Tyson Fury himself, expected the Wallin fight to be something like the Tom Schwartz fight. But it turned out to be far more difficult than the Tom Schwartz fight. And he's lucky that it didn't get stopped on a TKO. Because the punch that cut Tyson Fury's eye, again, it was a punch. It wasn't a headbutt. So anyway, before I get into a whole different scenario of talking about AJ Fury, well, I've already done it. Bringing it right back around to the main topic of this video, Anthony Joshua, rumored to be close to agreeing a £15 million or $20 million step-aside deal to allow Fury versus Usyk. I hope it happens, and that's no disrespect to Dylan White. I imagine he'd have to be compensated for that scenario as well. But just from a heavyweight boxing fan perspective, I think we need an undisputed fight, undisputed champion, should I say, sooner rather than later. And if this happens, then we'll get that. We'll get Fury versus Usyk. Now, if we do get Fury versus Usyk, how do you guys see it going? You think it's going to be the Gypsy King? Certainly in Britain, the vast majority of people are saying Tyson Fury's going to win. Whenever I see these interviews with boxers, with trainers, I mean, they're nearly all saying that Tyson Fury's going to beat Usyk because he's just too big and too strong. And they say that Usyk is highly skilled, but so is Tyson Fury. And so therefore you have to go with the big man because they're both very skilled, but Tyson Fury's got the advantages in size and strength and power and so on. Well, I don't think they realize that actually the gap in skill between Fury and Usyk is quite big. I mean, a lot of people will be surprised at how big the gap is. Now, it's not as big as the gap in skill between Usyk and Joshua, where it's bigger, but it's still quite big. Usyk has got better coordination than Tyson Fury. He throws his punches more correctly than Tyson Fury. He doesn't have this awkwardness to his shots that Fury has. He's got better balance, better coordination, moves his feet better. He's got better upper body movement on the front foot. Fury's very good on the back foot at slipping and sliding, making these defensive moves when someone's attacking him. But Alexander Usyk is good at moving his head coming forward. When he's right in front of you and he's actually looking to counter you and attack you, Usyk's moving his head all over the place, as well as moving his feet when he's right in range. You see, Tyson Fury doesn't have that ability to marry foot movement and head movement as well as offensive movement all together at the same time. That's not Fury. He's been developing his offense, obviously, under Javon Sugar Hill, but he's not on Usyk's level when it comes to that kind of thing. And that's no disrespect to Fury because, of course, Usyk is an elite fighter and a much smaller man. Generally speaking, smaller guys are better coordinated and they can do certain things athletically that bigger guys tend not to be as good at, generally speaking. So, I think people will be surprised when they step in the ring at how big an advantage Usyk actually has, technically, speed-wise, coordination, movement, and so on. He's going to have a big advantage over Fury. Fury is going to need to get hold of him. He's going to need to do what Anthony Joshua didn't, in my view, similar to what he did against Steve Cunningham. Now, some people have said this, by the way. Some people are not just, buying into this idea that Tyson Fury is a technical supremo against everybody. They too believe that won't really wash against Alexander Usyk, and he'll have to get stuck in if he's going to beat him, because if he's going to try and box the guy, I personally don't think that will work. The Tyson Fury who fought Klitschko, he'd have a much better chance of boxing with Usyk. Although even then, I don't think I would pick him to win in a boxing match against Usyk. I think he'd still have to get physical even then. But the Tyson Fury we have today at 270-something pounds, I don't see that guy outboxing Usyk, folks. I don't see it. I think he's going to have to get stuck in. I think he's going to have to hurt him, hit him in the body, rough him up, lean on him. And if he does that, maybe it will be enough. Then again, maybe not. This is why the fight is so intriguing to me, because I'm not quite sure. What I am sure about is that it will be a very difficult fight for Tyson Fury. I don't see this being easy. I see it being very, very difficult. Potentially the most difficult fight of his career. Usyk doesn't have the power of somebody like Deontay Wilder, so I'm not expecting Usyk to go in there and start letting the bombs fly and dropping Tyson Fury, although he got dropped by Steve Cunningham, so I wouldn't rule it out completely, but I would have thought that unlikely. What I would expect is a fight where Tyson Fury is made to look clumsy, where he's countered a lot, because Alexander Usyk is a much better counterpuncher than Tyson Fury. Not a little bit better, much better. He's on a completely different level in terms of counterpunching than Tyson Fury. Totally different level. And again, I think that would show up in the fight. It'd be Tyson Fury looking probably about as graceful as an elephant, trying to walk down and drag Alexander Usyk into a dogfight. Lots of holding and leaning, maybe holding and hitting like we saw against Cunningham, and just doing whatever he has to do to try and get the guy out of there. I don't think it will be pretty. if Tyson Fury wins. I mean, if it will be him winning ugly. But hey, that's the greatness of Tyson Fury, is that no matter what predicament he's in, he finds a way to win. It's like the old saying, win this time and worry about looking good next time. If you got to win ugly, win ugly. As long as you get the W. And Tyson Fury has always managed to get the W no matter how it looks. And that's the most important thing. That shows really the versatility. It shows the determination, you know? Because a guy like AJ in that Usyk fight, he was trying to be too pretty in there. You know? Trying to box with the guy and look all neat and tidy. Nah, man. Usyk is not the guy to look neat and tidy against. You got to go in there and take the fight to him. You're too big. The difference in coordination and depth perception and everything between you and Usyk is too big. You got to go in there and take the fight to the guy. And I'm sure Tyson Fury would. Anyway, this video is already, it was too long about 10 minutes ago. Way too long now. Hopefully you stuck with me to the end and enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide range of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&A sessions, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got a Discord server where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. There's no contract, no commitment, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.